Hey guys, I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff here. I've been subscribed to a few different channels and listened to a lot of different interviews. Some from Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, and a few other talk shows. And what I've been waiting to hear is the admission from someone in these, you know, sort of, I guess you would say, outside the media conversations, right? Like the conversations that are not mainstream, but the ones that are being sort of blocked and the ones that are sort of being pushed out from the the media. And I wanted to see when the conversation turned to demonic activity. Because I feel that the entire topic of demonic activity within society and how that plays a role in technology and in censorship, in the way that the systems are functioning is completely ignored. I mean, look at the way demonic activity has affected civilizations right from the beginning of time. There are stories of possessions and of, you know, strange visions and even like technologies and inspirations, prophecies, uh, all these types of things, dreams. I go back to the beginning, and you got these characters like Jordan Peterson and others who they fail to look at it from a perspective of this is a sentient, you know, reasoning, conscious and intelligent force that is acting upon humans and that is outside physical the physical realm. We have the abilities to measure energy. We have the ability to, you know, look at videos that show, people being lifted into the air or, cupboards opening and closing and paranormal activity and the rest of these things. And they're so widespread. There are a lot of them, right? And because of the advance of technology and how, we can now recreate and we can simulate so much, many people forget that this type of activity was happening long before we ever had technology. They tend to forget that when you look at the events that occurred 1,000 years ago, and miracles and curses, voodoo, the rest of it, none of it had to do with technology. None of it had to do with this modern age of special effects, you know? And the people that wrote about it and the stories that were told about it, they were so powerful that, they crossed generations, they influenced cultures, and they changed entire civilizations based on these belief systems that were developed because of their powers, right? And it's not an accident that the number one best-selling book every year is the Bible, and that in it it's filled with explanations of these spirit creatures, gods, you know? And the fact that this entire perspective is being ignored, I think that is something that is really telling, you know? Because the only times that I've come across that is when it's, in somehow in favor, right? It's like you're gonna see a show talking about demonic activity, and it's gonna be some scare tactic, right? Like, oh, we got these terrible things happening, all these terrible people. What about the political aspect behind it, huh? The demons have always been involved in politics. I mean, some of the earliest scriptures that talk about, the activity of demons are political, because it speaks that when Daniel, the prophet Daniel, wanted help, and he was praying for help, that an angel arrived to comfort him. But the angel said that he had been prevented by the king. Now, who could prevent an angel? Now, it said it was the king. And yet, Michael, which is the king of his people, came to help him, to support him. And the whole, experience was really telling, because it spoke from the perspective of angels, and that they had this rulership, this sense of governance over nations and over peoples, and that they would fight. And it really makes sense, because Satan is called the ruler of this world, and even when he offered Jesus the kingdoms of the world in exchange for an act of worship, right? Jesus didn't argue that. He didn't say, well, no, you can't offer that. That doesn't belong to you. That belongs to God. No. And you see, that's very telling too. Because the independence of mankind, that decision to be independent, oftentimes people ignore. They like to be independent. They like to think independently and free. But it also led them into a path of the devil, in the same structure of the rebel Satan and his authority. It's his mentality, right? But that's completely ignored. Nobody discusses that. Nobody discusses the demonic activity and how it's been influencing mankind, and how it's influencing politics and technology, how it affects YouTube and Facebook and the rest of it. Nobody discusses it, right? And I'm looking for that to change. That's what I'd like to change. I'd like for someone to step up and say, well, wait a minute. We're being controlled by demons, and the reason why all these activities are now becoming so hard to understand, when it comes to AI technologies, and when it comes to censorship, and why when you put on YouTube is everyone against Donald Trump, or why when you look up certain people and they're being ostracized and other people are not, right? Like, the effect that the demons can have on an electronic system such as YouTube or Facebook cannot be underestimated. That's why jw.org is so different, right? I mean, you go to jw.org and it is completely different. I mean, maybe it's not the type of news that, you'd normally hear, but at the same time, it's blessed. It's blessed because it's got a different atmosphere. It's got a different type of perspective on the world, right? It's got one of growing faith. It's not one of attacking people. It's not one of focusing on the little bites that we hear, because that's all it is. A lot of times these conversations with little bites these guys have left, right? You'll never hear jw.org talking about the right, the left. You'll never hear them talking about gay rights or anything like that. They're not interested in it. Their focus is so completely on the vindication of Jehovah's sovereignty that it doesn't matter to them, right? And the entire idea that there is a sovereign issue at play between the God of this system of things, the devil, and the God that created the universe, that needs to come out. That needs to be discussed. But do they want to talk about it? Apparently not. Even the people who are like being censored by everything else, and the ones who talk about conspiracies, they don't talk about it, And I think it's really telling. I think it shows that in order for you to recognize true religion, you have to step outside of what the devil is under control of. You have to be separate from it. Like, this video is probably not gonna get any views, right? And I'm pretty convinced that it's simply because the demonic activity upon the internet and upon YouTube and Facebook and the rest of it, the way they control it. I mean, I've had my own personal experiences with demonic activity, and I know that they're watching and they're paying very close attention, and they're organized. They never sleep. But for most people, when they hear that, oh, someone believes in demons, they think, well, this person, they've either had a psychotic episode, a psychotic break, or I mean, I don't mind people thinking and saying what they want, but when you don't examine the evidence that's been put out there for decades, century, when it comes to possessions, when it comes to visions, dreams, prophecies, that half the Bible is speaking about politics. It's speaking about the political kings and rulers of Israel and how they relied on a faith that was giving them very explicit directions. Like, the commandments were written by God's hand. You know what I mean? Like, the 10 plagues upon Egypt, they were from like exterior source, right? Crossing the Red Sea. I mean, these are major stories, like the flood. And their origin is not from the human source, right? And these people that try and excuse it and say, well, you know what, we can't, take the Bible literally. And, we can't look at these stories as actually having happened. But then they'll go turn around and say, yeah, this city that existed, at this specific time, and it's stated in the Bible that it existed in this specific time, ruled by this specific ruler. Yes, we've uncovered and unearthed, all this evidence in support of it. And the reason why we were even able to go here and look here is because it's written in scripture, and that's happened numerous times. The archaeologists, the ones who actually go out there and unearth the things that we find out about, they're using ancient texts in order to locate them and to understand them better, right? Our history, the history of mankind, is completely saturated in demonic and spiritual ideas. Both demonic and spiritual. Like, there is such a connection between the spirit realm and human politics that when you separate them, right, when you just say, okay, no, humans are the ones responsible for all the activities on Earth, what you're ignoring is such an integral part of history, such a pivotal part of mankind's life on Earth, that it's almost a lie. It's almost a lie to look at things from a perspective of, well, those people were not, serious. Those people were not, actually seeing things. I mean, you got like, 1 million people around the world that all say that you can't trust every scripture. And they're all saying the same thing, like whether they're confirmed atheists or whether they're, these evangelical, right? And they're saying the same thing. They're saying that, well, I know it said that, homosexuals, men who lie with men, will not inherit God's kingdom. I know it says that, but I mean, you got to look at the time they were living in. No. That wasn't mankind's perspective. That was God's perspective. That was the perspective of the creator of the universe, the person who would know best, right? And I think that that's being completely ignored. And when you look at the other perspective, the perspective of, no, you can make up your own mind. You can decide for yourself what's right and what's wrong. Where did that perspective come from? Well, that perspective came right at the Garden of Eden from the snake, who was later identified as the devil. And so the whole idea that we can create our own set of values and that we must create our own set of values is directly related to a detraction from biblical lessons, a distraction from the Garden of Eden. Jordan Peterson, for example, he talks about how, the Garden of Eden is a story of waking up. No, it isn't. It's not a story of self-consciousness. Oh, sure, it makes a good argument that, they became self-conscious because, they realized that they were naked, right? Well, think about this. Why would God actually punish them? Why would he kick them out of the garden and say that because of this, you have all this problem? Why would he become an enemy? Because that's what happens. When someone comes and says, I'm punishing you for doing this, right? I am actually telling you that you did wrong. And because you're doing something wrong, this is the outcome. Okay? That's punishment. Like, I warned you not to do it, and you did it. Right? That's like putting guilt, blame. Why would God do that? If it was just awareness that they were getting, why would God deliberately make it their fault? Right? Why would it suddenly be God saying, you're the bad guy here? That's making it seem that God's kind of cruel. He sets them up to fail. He set up mankind to fail. It's a rigged game. He put it there so that they would wake up, and then when they did, he punished them for it. Whose argument do you think that supports? God's or the devil's? It's interesting to note that when mankind first started out, they had to have sex with their own sisters and brothers in order to procreate. Something that was later determined to be wrong. Now, why was it determined to be wrong later? Well, isn't it because God set the standard and he's completely within his authority to change that? It's the same thing with the law covenant, right? When God first set out the law covenant, and they were not to eat certain animals, and you were not to, you had to do this Sabbath regularly. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, and there was a law covenant there that was abolished by Jesus, basically, by his apostles. When they came, they said that the law has been fulfilled. The covenant has been fulfilled. It was a precursor to the Christ. It was a building up so that man could understand things at that point. There is this element of progression and enlightenment throughout the Bible, right? And it doesn't have to do with God changing. It has to do with God having the right to make the decision when it's time to change things. Right? And that's the big difference. God has that right. And people that ignore that, they ignore the fact that an intelligent creator has the right to decide when there's something that needs changing and that it's the right thing to do in order for it to change in this way. That's governance. That's rulership right there. You know? But if you ignore that, if you ignore that, hey, look, this is when God's changed things. This is when God's come into the picture for mankind and said, no. The nation of Egypt can no longer enslave the Israelites. They must be set free. Right? It's not okay to do this anymore. To my people. You know what I mean? And then, okay, Jesus is slaughtered by basically the support of the Jewish empire, right? It was the Jews that called for Jesus' execution, and Jesus died because of that, right? Even though it was prophesied, at the same time, God said, this is no longer my people because they did this, right? God's decided that now it will be out of every nation, tribe, and tongue that the people who will be judging the earth shall be chosen, right? Because that's what the apostles were told. They were told that they would sit on thrones and that they would judge the 12 tribes. You know, that was a reward that they would receive for having given everything up and followed after Jesus. So these types of, political and religious topics that Muslims seem to recognize to a certain degree, because like Muslims, they connect their religion to their politics. They do that. And in Western society, there's a separation for that. And I appreciate the reason for it. It's like Jesus said that my kingdom is no part of this world. And so by saying that, it meant that his followers would, in imitation of him, also reject political office. But it's right back down to the same moral principle that man has dominated man to his injury. It doesn't mean that every political system is against God. It means that the political systems in power now are not recognizing God. They're not recognizing their place in God's arrangement. And they're trying to exercise power over each other in a way that hurts each other. And we see that. In fact, we see more evidence now of how people have dominated over other people on mass scales towards, a cultivation of hierarchies that are unjust, as Jordan Peterson would put it, than ever before. And every system of government that has been tried is now under attack. There is no alternative government that is being even suggested that would bring a utopia. In fact, if there was a person who was to suggest that their form of government was to bring a utopia, that person would be considered dangerous. And consider that. If Jesus himself was to come to earth and to say that he will judge and he will separate the good and the bad, and that the good will live forever, and that the bad will be exterminated, the people would consider him to be a very dangerous person. They wouldn't love Jesus. They wouldn't come in droves to support him. No, they would consider him to be dangerous because they don't recognize his authority. They don't recognize that Jesus has the authority from God to be able to do these things. In fact, there are so many that believe that if they saw Jesus, or if they, somehow had a personal vision of God, that they would somehow change their minds, right? Well, look at the Israelites. Look at when they had miracles being performed. Were the religious leaders of their time able to look at those miracles and those, amazing events and say, "Oh wow, we have someone from God"? No. Even though that they were not atheists, they didn't have all the scientific literature that be able to look into it and say, well, there's a reason for this and there's a reason for that. They didn't have any of that, but they still didn't believe. Right? So you look at what would it need to be like? What would the atmosphere need to be like in order to properly judge people? Well, one, people would need to be personally accountable for their own, I guess you could say, beliefs, right? Because in the past it was like, oh, well, you're a tribe that believes this, and you're from that tribe, and so because you're from that tribe, you believe that. You grew up in this society, and they all believe that, and so, that's normal that you believe that. It's no longer really like that with the new generation. Not with the generation that's being born today, with social media the way it is, and with the news actually being, somehow decreased. See? And because it's no longer like that, the ability for God to come in and say, I'm judging the nations, and for people to recognize that, oh yes, judging the nations doesn't mean that you're judging an individual. It means that you're judging all individuals. It doesn't mean that you're judging a tribe or a country, but you're judging all tribes and all countries. Because like the prophecy says that in that day, those killed will be from one end of the earth clear to the other. Right? Every prophecy that's ever been prophesied in the Bible has always come true, except the ones that are yet coming. But before that happens, there's going to be a turn on religion. And that is something we do see. We see a great turn against religion. I mean, you name it. Whether it's the news talking about the hiding pedophiles in freaking the Catholic Church, or whether it's the Muslims, jihadists, every form of religion is becoming taboo, to talk about and to preach. I mean, look at Russia. They have just taken out Jehovah's Witnesses. Like they've just banned them. They took over their whole branch office. Is that reported on? Does anyone in the news talk about that? Does anybody on Facebook have a channel saying, hey, look at what's happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia? Why isn't it? Why are they talking about tweets? When these things are going on and they're only talking about tweets, think about censorship in media, right? Think about the way that the monopolies have taken over both Facebook, YouTube and that. And the reason why that's not being talked about. So I'm bringing it to everyone's attention because I figured that, if you're watching Joe Rogan and you're watching Jordan Peterson and you want to hear something true that's different, this is true and different. And I bet you anything I'm not going to get views. Go figure. This is Keith. I'm out.